The income distribution in China has become more unequal over time, and today is among the most unequal in the world. Take a look at this Gini coefficient map. This is from the CIA World Factbook 2009. The data is very similar today. It shows that China is purple, which is on the higher end of the Gini coefficients, meaning more income inequality compared to some other countries. It's most similar to the US, Mexico, and some South American countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina. Over here in the East, it's most comparable to Malaysia. These are countries that are known for high income inequality, but not all of these countries have the same reason for inequality. With China, it is a combination of two things. First, market-based reforms. Markets bring about income inequality because they allow people to voluntarily trade with other people. That means that some people are going to be more valuable in trade than others, leading to different income levels. The other reason, though, that compounds the inequality in China is the centralization of political power. Because the government has such a large dominion over the economy, we learned that half of GDP comes from state-owned enterprises, and over 90% of the stock market cap is from state-owned enterprises, meaning that the political authorities have a lot of control over the economy, and that flows to them in income. That also means that the children and the family members and the people that are tied to the political class are going to have distinct economic advantages as well. So it's really a twofold effect: market forces and political centralization leading to high levels of income inequality. Now, when you look at the map, you'll notice that China shows up as one color. But that's a little misleading because the income inequality that we see in China is most pronounced in the big cities compared to the more suburban or rural areas. And this makes sense because in the big cities, you're going to have the most productive people, those in high finance, high tech, and manufacturing, but you're also going to have some of the least productive people, people that may have physical or mental disabilities, people that may struggle with getting a footing in a market system. And that means more diversity of income. It's worth noting, however, that despite increasing inequality, the standards of living of the poorest have significantly increased over time. We don't want to make the common mistake of suggesting that because there's greater income inequality over time, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. In fact, more often it is the rich getting richer at a faster pace than the poor are getting richer. So income inequality is increasing, but everybody's boats are rising. This pattern is confirmed with the following data. This is from the World Bank, and it shows the percent under US $5.50 per day. So $5.50, it equates to about $2,000 a year in income. So this would be the percent of people in China living off of less than 2,000 US dollars per year. Back in 1990, it was 98% of the population. Okay? And you'll notice it's dropped off, where today, or 2016, closest we have, it's 23%. So poverty is real in China. There's no doubt about it. And it's most pronounced in those rural settings. But it is getting better. And it has been getting better as a result of the reforms that have taken place. Another element of the Chinese economy is the one-child policy. Initially put into place in 1979 under Deng as part of the reform era, it limited women to having one child. The objective is obvious. They wanted to control population growth. And they did. Take a look at this data. This is from the Trading Economics site, where they're pulling population growth rates on an annual basis from the World Bank. Notice that by 1980, the population growth rates had already dropped quite a bit. They were upwards of 3% in the early 70s, and by the early 80s, it was less than 1.5%. Then the policy goes into place, and you really don't see a pronounced drop until we get to the early 90s, and it eventually gets down to today where it's less than 0.5%. Okay, so why would they want to do this? From an economic standpoint, it seems a bit counterintuitive because we know that population growth is labor growth, which is output growth, right? You have more of the resource labor, just like any resource, capital, technology, natural resources, you should be able to produce more output. So by restricting the growth of population, China is restricting the growth of labor, which is restricting its growth of output. Why do it then? One explanation is that China wanted to increase the amount of capital per worker. So by restricting population growth, the amount of equipment that would be available to each worker would increase, and that would make each worker more productive, raising the per capita income of each worker. In other words, it was more about per capita growth than overall national growth. Another way of putting this from our previous lessons is it was about intensive growth as opposed to extensive growth. Another explanation has to do with the socialist elements of the economy. Because remember, even in the late 70s, as these market-based reforms were being put into place, the majority of people are still getting their provisions from government. But government is finding it more and more difficult to provide. So by restricting the growth of the population, they can keep the provisions higher. In both cases, you'll notice it's about raising the per capita income of the average person, either by increasing the capital per worker to make them more productive, or by raising the allocation government can provide per worker. Why the emphasis on the individual? And this probably has a lot to do with international trade. China in the late 70s is attempting to develop a relationship with the Western higher income countries because they're going to be the best customers in this new market. And as a result, they need to justify having a communist government to what are mostly democracies. And that's hard to do. Most democratic countries don't like to trade with autocratic countries. Look at how limited trade is between the US and Cuba, or between the US and Venezuela, or North Korea. It's almost non-existent. And China ran the risk of having this same outcome. So China wanted that international cachet. By raising people, its own people out of poverty, it would more likely get that. It would also stave off any sort of rebellion. This is a period in the late 70s and early 80s where there's still a lot of uncertainty as to how accepting the people are going to be of this new system. Now let's talk about the consequences of the one-child policy. The most obvious is the invasion of personal freedoms. To force women to only have one child means that you have to have compliance. And compliance was done through mandated contraception, sterilizing women, and even forced abortions. Now, this varied based on the provincial governments. Some governments were more strict than others, and clearly, if you lived in a big city, there was much more enforcement than if you live in a rural area where you may almost never run into a government official. But it's important to note that as hard as China is working at this time to gain international acceptance of its regime, this is tarnishing that regime's image. Because in Western culture, in free market democracies, individuals have rights, especially over their own body. But those rights don't necessarily accrue in dictatorial societies. Remember, in a communist country, you are one part of a larger whole. The whole is what matters, not the individual. And it is the government that is given responsibility to manage that larger society, even if it comes at the expense of personal freedoms. So it's hard for Westerners to accept that because we focus on the individual more than on the collective. A second consequence has been a demographic shift. There are more males relative to females in China than most other countries. This is because historically males have had advantages that females did not. So if a family is only going to be allotted one child, they're likely to pursue a male child and abort females until they get that. Having more males relative to females can affect future fertility in the country, even if the policy were eliminated. A third consequence of this policy has to do with the aging population. By reducing the number of babies being born after 1979, you effectively shift the number of older people to a larger proportion relative to younger people. This can make a lot of programs that are designed to subsidize senior citizens, like healthcare programs and retirement programs, more insolvent. Because remember, the government relies on young workers to pay in to these programs and then channels that money to older retirees and dependents. But if there's less young people, then there's less money flowing in and ultimately less money going out to the large pool of seniors. This also hits seniors at a non-governmental level because if, like most Chinese, they rely on family to support them when they're young, well, a senior citizen may have less children to take care of them and therefore less money flowing from their own family to subsidize their retirement years. By the way, this is the same effect that's occurring in America today. The difference is Americans have chosen to have less children over the last several decades, which has led to a larger senior population compared to the youthful population. It's created imbalances in Social Security and Medicare and familial support of aging populations. So it's not unique to China. What is unique is the mandated one-child policy that led to this demographic change. A fourth issue that emerges is those children that are born in violation of the one-child policy, the second, third, fourth, etc. child, they are not going to have the same rights that those that are born legally have. They essentially become undocumented immigrants in their own country. It's kind of analogous to the hukou system we talked about before, where if your family resides in one area and that's where you are supposed to live, and you choose to live in a non-authorized area, you effectively relinquish many of your rights as a Chinese citizen. Well, this is worse in a sense because you're not allowed to reside anywhere in China because you were not allowed to be born. So you have this underclass of people that were born in violation of the one-child policy that are not granted the same rights. Finally, it's important to keep in mind that the policies have changed over time. For example, in 2015, they opened the door for a second child per household. It's also worth noting that many of the more aggressive measures that were used in the past are not believed to be used today. We never really know with China because we're not privy to information like we would be from other democratic countries where information is released publicly. China contains a lot of the details of what goes on. But from testimonials, we find that today, having a child that is beyond 2 will typically result in financial penalties, but not necessarily anything beyond that. Okay, we'll pick up in the next video. Thanks.